Why does no one talk about how King Philip II's body began to rot before he even died? He spent his final days in unspeakable agony, his skin blackening, flesh falling away. While priests whispered prayers he could barely hear over his own screams. Some say he welcomed death, others say he believed he deserved to suffer. A ruler of the world's most powerful empire, locked away in a palace that felt more like a tomb. But why did one of history's richest and most powerful monarchs choose to die like this, alone, in rot and silence? This isn't just about death. It's about guilt, obsession, and the terrifying price of ruling a dying empire. This video is based on an analysis of rare Spanish monastic records, fragments of medical notes secretly written by Philip's own physician, and transcripts from the Escorial Monastery archives that remained untranslated for centuries. Some of these accounts were never meant to be public, partially redacted by the Church and buried in footnotes of obscure historical journals. But today, we're going to open them. If you stay with us until the end, you'll uncover why Philip built his own tomb before he died and chose to live in it. It was more than a royal residence. It was part basilica, part tomb, part prison. What strange ritual he demanded during his final hours, the real reason his body decomposed before death, and what that says about his legacy. This is not the story they teach you in school. This is the hidden death of Philip II, the man who ruled an empire where the sun never set, and died in the shadows of his own making. What was Spain's most powerful king doing in a cold, stone monastery, refusing even a cushion to ease his pain? At the height of his reign, gold poured in from the New World, and his ships dominated the seas. But behind the grandeur was a man slowly breaking. Philip II, son of Charles V, had inherited the largest empire in the world: Spain, the Americas, the Philippines, parts of Italy, the Low Countries. Philip ruled not from a lavish palace, but from a building he had constructed himself, El Escorial. It was more than a royal residence. It was part basilica, part tomb, part prison. He lived in a tiny chamber that looked into the chapel, so he could attend Mass without leaving his bed. And that bed, it was deliberately hard, flanked by relics of saints and items that reminded him of sin, death, and penance. To understand Philip's final hours, you need to understand this. He didn't just fear God. He feared his own soul, and that any failure on his part would doom not only him, but the millions he ruled over. Every plague, every lost ship, every famine, he took personally as a sign of God's judgment. According to letters preserved in the Archivo General de Simancas, Philip believed his empire was a divine burden. Why would a man who could have anything choose agony? Not with words, but with action. And so he punished himself, even as his legs ulcerated, even when his stomach turned against him. Philip refused basic comforts. His sheets were changed only when soaked with blood. He denied himself painkillers that were readily available to nobles at the time. Crushed opium and laudanum. Mixtures were reportedly rejected. One theory, proposed in a controversial thesis by Spanish scholar Martin de Leon 1987, claims Philip may have believed he was the Old Testament Job, tested by God through pain. In exchange for eternal glory, Some claim it was his own order. Others suggest his confessor, a Dominican friar, insisted on purification through suffering, would soon become something far more disturbing and irreversible. But why? The rotting wasn't the worst part. The rituals came next. Was it gangrene, or was it divine retribution? Historians still debate whether it was deep-rooted Catholic guilt, a psychological obsession with sin, or a personal sense of cosmic responsibility. Yet, as we'll see, what began as spiritual penance, skin sloughing off his fingers, blackened toes, an odor of decay, before his breath even stopped. Because there's one thing most people don't know about Philip II's decline. It wasn't just slow, it was visible. He was dying on the outside first. And that brings us to the disease that defined his final year, and the rumors it sparked. Was it cancer? But that was just the beginning. The rotting wasn't the worst part. The rituals came next. Part 2. The rot from within, disease, decay, and a room that smelled like death. It began with a limp. Philip II had suffered from gout for most of his adult life, a nobleman's disease, some called it, brought on by rich foods and sedentary rule. But by the final year of his life, the pain was no longer confined to his joints. His entire lower body had become a battlefield of lesions, ulcers, and open wounds. Advanced edema and suspected Fournier's gangrene. The physicians at the time, however, only referred to it in Latin, putrefactio viva, living rot. In one of the king's last recorded letters, written by a scribe as he dictated through gritted teeth, he described the sensation as being gnawed alive by the devil. According to fragments found in the Libros de los Medicos reels, a set of partially preserved medical journals now stored in the Escorial archive. Philip suffered from a combination of septic ulcers, vinegar compresses, burned rosemary, and incense to purify the air. Even holy relics were brought into the room. Nothing worked. They tried everything. Bloodletting. The gangrene spread so aggressively that, according to one friar's testimony in a 17th century ecclesiastical record, the king's attendants had to wrap his feet in linen soaked with myrrh and oil, only to change them twice daily as the flesh decayed and sloughed off into the fabric. One courtier wrote, "The chamber of His Majesty is a crucible of holy suffering. The stench is unbearable. All who enter do so on their knees." He believed, according to the confessor who sat by him daily, that the hand of God would cure him or end him. No in between. But what haunts modern scholars the most is what Philip refused: surgical intervention. By 1598, rudimentary amputations could have been attempted, crude, brutal, but potentially life-extending. Philip denied them all. He believed, according to the confessor who sat by him daily, that the hand of God would cure him or end him. No in between. And yet, something else lingered behind his refusal. Fear. Fear of dying in sin, of dying unnaturally, of dying too soon. A whisper began among the servants that Philip wasn't just in pain. He was being punished, not by God, but by the ghosts of what he had done. The Inquisition, the executions in the Low Countries, the fate of his first son, Don Carlos, whose mysterious death many still attribute, quietly, to Philip's own hand. though no priest ever admitted it openly. Several accounts note the king muttering confessions not part of any formal rite, talking to the ceiling, crying for forgiveness from the blood of boys. No one knew what it meant, or at least they pretended not to. Hidden for over a century, they were only uncovered during a recataloguing in 1923. One passage stands out. The decay wasn't just physical. It was psychological. There are 3 pages, torn, faded, and water damaged, attributed to Dr. Juan Frere, the royal physician who attended Philip in his final 3 weeks. According to one friar, he stared into it for 3 hours straight, refusing food, prayer, or visitors. The king sees things in the wall. He weeps when the bells ring at vespers, and calls them the voices of the condemned. I fear more for his soul than his body. But there's something even more chilling. In the last week of his life, Philip ordered a mirror, something he had forbidden in his chamber for over a year, to be placed near his bed. When asked what he saw, the king reportedly whispered, "I look like Lazarus, but there is no Christ." For what? No one is certain. But after he died, a peculiar object was found beneath his bed. What kind of man chooses to watch himself rot? Why did the most powerful monarch in the Catholic world refuse salvation when it was seemingly offered? Some say he was too far gone. Others say he wanted to feel every second of it. That his suffering was not just punishment, but payment. For what? No one is certain. But after he died, a peculiar object was found beneath his bed. A small, tarnished reliquary. Inside, a piece of linen stained red, labeled in Latin, Reliquia di Carlos. Carlos, his son. Whether it was truly Carlos' blood or just a symbolic item, no one can say. But the implication shook even the hardiest priests. Could it be that Philip believed his son's death was a sin that could never be washed away? And so he rotted, willingly, without opium, without forgiveness, without relief. But the most haunting part isn't what he endured. It is what he demanded happen after his death. Part 3. The Ritual of Bones, Philip's final orders, and the construction of a tomb for the living before his death. Philip II made a request that baffled and unsettled the entire court. He wanted to die in the Panteon de los Reyes, the royal crypt. But there was a problem. It wasn't finished yet. The Escorial Monastery, which he had spent decades designing, building, and obsessing over, was meant to be more than a palace or a church. It was a machine for eternity, a stone labyrinth of prayer, silence, and cold symmetry, with one purpose: to serve as the final resting place of Spain. As divine kings, Philip had directed every detail of its architecture, down to the number of steps from his bedroom to the altar, dragging himself through cold stone, halls refusing assistance, to sit alone in the dark. He built the crypt to remind future monarchs, and himself, that death is not to be avoided. It is to be prepared for every single day. But in his final weeks, he began making strange additions. According to a letter sent by architect Juan de Herrera to court officials in July 1598, preserved in the Archivo General de Indias, Philip ordered a small, candlelit antechamber to be carved into the rock adjacent to the future tomb. Only one person was allowed inside, him Servants said he spent hours there, even as his condition worsened, dragging himself through cold stone halls, refusing assistance, to sit alone in the dark. What did he do in that chamber? That's where the mystery deepens. A Jesuit friar named Alonso di Medrano, in a posthumous testimony written in 1602, described the antechamber as having nothing but a stone slab, a crucifix, and a brass basin filled with what smelled like vinegar and ashes. He also claimed to have once seen the king burning pieces of parchment, mumbling something that sounded like peccatum meum, Latin for my sin. What were the documents? What sins? No one knows. They were never found. But there was another order, one even more controversial. Philip instructed his embalmers, upon death, to not mask his decay. No perfumes, no artificial preservation, no embalming beyond what canon law required. Why? Instead, his body was to be treated as a relic, exposed for several days, so the court could witness the wages of sin. And in a macabre twist, he asked that his burial clothes be stitched with thread taken from penitential sackcloth, the same kind worn by heretics during public autos da fe. Others argue it was a cryptic admission. Some believe it was a final gesture of humility. This was theater, spiritual, political, and deeply personal. What king dresses like a heretic for his own funeral? This was not tradition. It gets stranger inside. Philip had laid out a list of things not to be said at his funeral. A sealed letter, opened only after his death, was delivered to the Council of Castile. No mention of divine right, no mention of imperial glory, no invocation of lineage. Beyond Charles V instead, he requested one phrase be spoken aloud, 1598, with a crucifix in hand and monks chanting the Litany of the Saints. Here lies a sinner who ruled and failed. It shocked the clergy. It disoriented the nobles. But the instructions were followed, mostly. Now here's where history gets blurry. There are conflicting reports about what actually happened during his final hours. One version, from the official court records, says he died peacefully at 5:15 a.m. on September 13, 1598, with a crucifix in hand and monks chanting the Litany of the Saints. Another, far more disturbing account comes from a second-hand testimony by a German diplomat, Heinrich von Solms, whose journal, rediscovered in the 1800s, describes the king's body. His face was black as coal, his tongue swollen, the room filled with a stench so strong my valet wept and crossed himself. This was no death of a saint. Political propaganda, or the truth that official scribes dared not publish? Is this exaggeration? We may never know. And quietly transferred to the Escorial crypt, beneath the altar of the basilica he had built with his own hand. What we do know is this. Philip's body was placed inside a coffin of black wood. A monk reportedly whispered, "Even now, he resists heaven." It is said, though not officially recorded, that as his coffin was lowered, the chain broke once. It thudded loudly onto the floor below, and yet, for all this planning, all this ritual, all this obsession, Philip was never buried where he wanted to be. His bones were moved, reburied, rearranged. Today, his coffin lies among others, behind locked doors, beneath stone, barely distinguishable from the rest. The Pantheon de los Reyes wasn't completed. Until decades after his death, no throne, no crown, no glory, just silence. But his chamber, the place where he watched himself rot, is still there. Tourists aren't allowed inside. Others speak of an unease, a feeling, impossible to name, that creeps in just beneath the skin. Even skeptics admit it. Something about the place feels wrong. Few even know it exists. And those who do say, if you lean close to the stone, you can still smell vinegar. Part 4. The ghost that would not leave. Legends, echoes, and the haunting of El Escorial. Centuries after his death, whispers still echo through the cold corridors of El Escorial. Some are architectural marvels, admiring its symmetry and grandeur. And always, the sense of being watched. Whether it's the sharp, lifeless geometry of the hallways or the cold, sound-swallowing silence of its granite chambers. Visitors and caretakers alike have reported a presence, one that seems to linger near the royal chamber, Catholic guilt echoing through time, or something else, and more specifically, around what used to be Philip's private antechamber of death. Is it superstition? Let's break it down. Over the next 50 years, different monks in the Escorial community recorded similar happenings. The earliest reports of anomalies came less than a year after Philip's death. No signs of forced entry, no footsteps on the dust. In 1599, a monk named Fray Esteban de Lugo wrote in his diary, "The king's chamber remains sealed, yet twice this week the door was found ajar at Lodz." These entries were long thought to be errors or exaggerations, until a curious pattern emerged. Candles extinguished without draught, the sound of dragging footsteps in the empty corridors. The area had been sealed to decades prior. He was later declared mentally unfit and removed from the monastery. One of their most controversial claims was that Philip II's chamber was never truly purified. After his death, among the Spanish elite, whispers turned into rumors that Philip II's ghost was bound to the monastery, that his refusal to truly repent, to surrender, left his soul wandering. Sudden cold patches, particularly near the hidden staircase between Philip's bedroom and the chapel. The stones remember. Then there's the case of Brother Mateo, who, in 1633, reportedly collapsed in the antechamber after hearing what he described as a voice reciting psalms backwards. But here's the twist. Brother Mateo had no access to the private antechamber. Only two are known to survive, one in the Biblioteca Nacional, another in private hands. So how did he know it existed? During the 18th century, Spain's Jesuits, often critics of royal excess, began compiling oral histories of unexplainable phenomena at Escorial. In an anonymous pamphlet published in 1739, titled Las Sombras del Escorial, The Shadows of Escorial, a Jesuit priest wrote, "He died unshriven, confessed only to his mirror." It's a poetic line, but the church was not amused. The pamphlet was condemned, and its copies burned. Still, the damage was done. Among the Spanish elite, whispers turned into rumors that Philip II's ghost was bound to the monastery, that his refusal to truly repent, to surrender, left his soul wandering. But was this just symbolic, a metaphor for imperial decline, or did they mean it literally? Fast forward to the 1930s. During the Second Spanish Republic, a wave of secular scholars began studying sites tied to Catholic monarchs. Escorial was chief among them. One researcher, Dr. Antonio Morales, a psychologist with a fascination for post-mortem hauntings, received special permission to conduct environmental readings inside Philip's chamber. His team reported extreme temperature anomalies despite stable external conditions. Unexplained fluctuations in electromagnetic readings, though crude by modern standards. Sudden feelings of dread, nausea, and in cases, temporary aphasia. A loss of the ability to speak. Dr. Morales would later call the Escorial a cathedral of repressed guilt, psychological, much like trauma echoes in the minds of the living. Perhaps places to can grieve. Something else? At its end, a small chamber, long and narrow, with scorched stone on the floor, a rusted iron bowl, and a rotted wooden chair, too degraded for DNA confirmation, but sufficient to confirm something ritualistic happened there. His findings were suppressed during Franco's regime, but resurfaced in academic circles in the 1980s, igniting renewed debate about whether spaces can absorb suffering. He made it sacred and cursed it in the same breath. Is it spiritual? One fringe theory proposes that Philip's prolonged self-inflicted torment, spiritual, physical, and emotional, imprinted his anguish into the very walls. But there's a more tangible, more chilling theory. In 1993, during restoration work on the Escorial Basilica, workers accidentally uncovered a sealed passage behind the altar wall. The layout matched descriptions of Philip's secret antechamber. No public tours, no official acknowledgement inside the bowl. Forensic tests found traces of human blood and ashes. The site was resealed under quiet orders. But one Vatican historian, speaking off record to La Razón in 2001, admitted, "Yes, we know what it is. No, we don't open it." To this day, no Spanish monarch has ever chosen to sleep in that section of Escorial again. They visit, they pray, but no one lives there. No one stays. Even now, night guards stationed at the monastery have reported strange phenomena. Shadows moving in the periphery of candlelight, the smell of vinegar, and one guard, anonymously interviewed for a local podcast in 2022, said, "It's not that I saw him. It's that I felt someone who used to be a king, still trying to rule something." Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is undeniable. Philip II never truly left Escorial. His obsession shaped it, his torment stained it, and his death, slow, deliberate, and unshriven, left behind not just legend, but something far colder. But what if the rot didn't end with his body? What if it infected the empire itself? That's what we explore next. Part 5. The empire that died with him, legacy, collapse, and the ghosts of power or consequence. When Philip II took his final breath in 1598, his empire still spanned for continents. But less than a century later, Spain was no longer the dominant world power. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether Philip's death marked the physical end of a man or the spiritual death of an empire. Let's examine the evidence and the theory. In the decades before Philip's death, Spain was often spoken of as a second Rome. destined to shape the fate of civilization through divine right, military conquest, and unwavering Catholicism. Philip believed it, so did most of Europe. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were already forming. The Spanish Armada had failed in 1588, costing tens of thousands of lives and devastating the treasury. Revolt simmered in the Netherlands, the seeds of a rebellion that Philip's successors would never fully control. Inflation ravaged the economy as silver from the New World destabilized local prices and wages. And perhaps most fatally, Philip's obsession with bureaucratic control and micromanagement had crippled innovation and flexibility. He was a monarch obsessed with detail, reviewing documents line by line, issuing commands down to village-level decisions, yet never trusting his own advisors. As historian Geoffrey Parker notes in Imprudent King, Philip II ruled an empire he did not understand with documents. He could not physically read fast enough. The empire was rotting, just like him. Philip's successor, Philip III, lacked the iron will of his father. While Philip II isolated himself in monasteries, his son surrounded himself with favorites. Men like the Duke of Lerma, who used power for personal gain rather than national glory. In just a generation, court politics replaced crusading zeal, and the mechanisms of empire began to rust. But here's where things get truly eerie. Some members of the court believed that Philip II's suffering had been a divine signal, not of his own guilt, but of Spain's doom. His agonizing death, they whispered, was the price of pride, expansion, and persecution. One friar, in a banned 1601 sermon, even called the Escorial a monument to Catholic hubris. He was arrested within a week. Beyond metaphor, some genuinely believed that the Escorial itself, built on land said to be haunted before construction, carried a curse. Philip's strange rituals, the burning of documents, the secret antechamber, all fuel speculation that he had bound something to the land. In the early 17th century, royal births declined, plagues returned, ships sank. Philip IV avoided extended stays at Escorial. Charles II, the last Habsburg king, reportedly refused to sleep there, citing unquiet dreams. Territories rebelled. Superstition began to circulate. The sun set over the king before it set over Spain. Even monarchs who never publicly believed in curses seemed wary. And who could blame him? Philip II had built a palace that was also a tomb, then lived in it as his body fell apart, one organ at a time. No other monarch before or since had attempted such a thing. Philip II had long been the architect of Spain's moral mission, using the Inquisition to purify his empire from within. But many now argue that this system, brutal, paranoid, and deeply flawed, turned Spain inward, stifling science, innovation, and dissent. One scholar from the University of Salamanca coined the term the mirror state, a country that, like Philip in his final hours, stared too long at its own reflection, unable to look away from sin, fear, and death. It's poetic, but it's also political. By 1700, Spain was no longer the dominant empire. Its power had fractured, its economy stagnated, and its culture locked in nostalgia for a golden age that had, perhaps, never truly existed. Some say Philip was the last king to believe completely in the myth of empire. And when that belief died, so did the empire. The monarchy is constitutional. The Inquisition is history. Modern Spain has largely secularized, but El Escorial still stands. Tourists visit, monks still pray, but the air remains thick with memory, not just of Philip's death, but of everything it symbolized. The cost of believing you're chosen by God. The weight of guilt you can't confess for a soul that isn't. The danger of building something eternal. Every few years, new researchers petition to reopen the sealed chamber beneath the altar. The one Philip built for himself. Every time, they're denied. The official reason, preservation of historical integrity. But the real reason may be whispered best by an archivist. In a 2011 interview, some kings leave behind treasures, others ghosts. So what can we learn from the man who ruled the world and chose to die rotting in his own tomb? That legacy is not power. It is what you leave behind when no one is watching. And sometimes, what you leave behind never really leaves. So now you know. Philip II, the most powerful man of his age, chose to die in a monastery he built like a tomb. He refused painkillers, rejected comfort, watched himself rot, day by day, in a dark chamber where even the priests whispered in fear. He was king of the greatest empire on earth, but in the end, he became something else entirely. A relic, a warning, a ghost with a crown. And yet, his story remains buried, almost never told in full. Why? Perhaps because it reveals a truth that makes even history uncomfortable. That power does not protect you from guilt. That kings rot like the rest of us. That sometimes the most terrifying part of an empire is not how it ends, but how it dies slowly from the inside out. But now, you've seen what most people haven't. You've walked the stone halls of El Escorial, smelled the vinegar, heard the chants echo off cold marble, and stared into the mirror that Philip stared into moments before he died, not as a king, but as a sinner. If this fascinated you, there's more. In our next episode, we uncover the chilling fate of King Charles II, Spain's final Habsburg, a man so deformed and cursed. His court believed he was the spawn of the devil. You won't believe how he lived or how he was buried. Subscribe if you want to keep digging into the forgotten, the buried, and the bizarre truths history tried to erase. Like the video if you learned something new. And tell us in the comments, do you think Philip II was haunted or just guilty? Because sometimes the line between madness and mercy is written in ashes.